event. We want to start with a recording notice, just so all participants know we are recording today's event so that anyone who is not able to be here today can view the show at a later time. So just know that if you do participate through audio, camera, or chat, you are consenting to being recorded. The recording will be available on the SDG series website, at the same place where you got the link to register. We'll share it in the chat soon as well. We are also excited to share captioning this evening. If you are interested in live captioning, navigate to the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom page, and you should see an icon like the one in the picture. And if you click that, you can click show subtitle. And if you want to turn it off, you can do it the same way. You can also view the full transcript this way. In terms of participation, though all participants were muted upon entry, we do want to let you know that you have the ability to unmute. So we ask that you please stay muted if you aren't speaking to ensure higher overall audio quality. That being said, we do encourage and welcome your participation. We'd love to hear your comments throughout the night. So please share your questions and thoughts in the chat, which is also located at the bottom of your screen. Or you can raise your hand if you click the reactions icon and click raise your hand, and a facilitator can call on you. We want to provide many different avenues for engagement, so we will also be live tweeting tonight. If you follow SDG series, you can follow along, and you can tag us in your posts and use hashtag Hawks for SDG so that we can find you. If you have any further questions related to logistics or technology, please do share them in the chat and one of us will get back to you shortly. In the meantime, I'd like to turn it over to Anne, the principal of Mount Madonna School, to open the event and introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Blythe. So thank you for joining us this evening. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and throughout the evening, you're going to hear us refer to them as the SDGs. They were designed to build a global partnership and a coalition aimed at addressing a myriad of global challenges. The Sustainable Development Goals serve as an international call to action. They really represent a blueprint for pursuing economic growth and innovation, social inclusion and equity, and environmental stewardship. This blueprint charts a course for all sectors of society to mobilize and to work towards achieving these goals. Educating our students to become discerning global citizens is central to achieving a sustainable future. At Mount Madonna School, we are committed to fostering global citizenship by developing the capacity and skills of our students to not simply understand the world in which they live, but to develop agency to improve it. We emphasize how actions big and small can have an immense impact worldwide. Indeed, many of our alumni have gone on to become leaders, and their work is having profound impacts on the world. The MMS community takes great pride in their achievements. This evening, Laxmi, a 1993 graduate of Mount Madonna School, will speak about American democracy, American racism. She holds a bachelor's degree in engineering from Princeton University and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Laxmi is a founding member and a senior advisor to the Leadership Now project. The organization, composed of business and thought leaders, is committed to moving from words to actions to advance racial equity. Tonight, we will learn about how the fight for democracy and the fight for equality have long been intertwined in the United States. The events of 2020 and COVID-19 have unmasked systemic racism, and the Leadership Now project has performed an analysis that lays out the critical linkages between systemic racism and the flaws in our democratic system. Their analysis demonstrates the ways in which voter participation, electoral systems, campaign finance, and representation in politics are both products of and contributors to structural racism. This evening is going to be organized into 3 parts. The seminar by Laxmi, followed by the values style facilitated conversation led by our upper school director and our 12th grade students, In the final part, we're going to ask the audience to participate and ask any questions. So thank you. And it's my pleasure and truly my honor to introduce you to Laxmi.
Thank you, Anne, for the lovely introduction, and thank you, Mount Madonna seniors and the school for having me. It's been a long time since I've been on campus, but feels like I'm back at home, so thank you. I am going to share my screen. Bear with me. So I hope everyone can see the screen. Great. So I'm going to talk about the systemic and institutional racism that exists in our democracy. Anne introduced me. I'm class of 1993 from Mount Madonna. After I graduated from undergrad and business school, I spent my career in the sort of tech space the last several years as an entrepreneur. So I come at this as a business leader, as a concerned citizen. And just to remind everyone, I'm not a legal expert. I'm not a policy expert. I just, with my fellow Leadership Now members, we look at the data and really try to, where we see inequity, try to fight that. So let me tell you a little bit about Leadership Now. Leadership Now is a national membership organization made up of, we call ourselves principled business leaders, as opposed to nonpartisan or bipartisan. We are made up of individuals from across the aisle. But what we do have in common is that we care about our democracy. So part of that is embracing our 4 key principles to protect our democracy while renewing it, to promote fact-based, evidence-based policymaking, to create an economy that works for all, and to embrace diversity as an asset. We started out in 2017 with just a handful of members, and we've grown to over 300 members across 6 official chapters, and now we have emerging chapters in Wisconsin, Texas, Georgia, and Florida. I will tell you personally, I came to this really after the 2016 election, and really, maybe like a lot of you felt, like, how could this happen? Felt like we were making a lot of progress as a democracy, as a country, and it felt like this partisanship. That 2016 election was sort of very, kind of hit me hard. And then I thought, but I didn't do anything to, other than vote, I didn't really do much to contribute to changing that outcome. So part of my first step is I went to the Women's March. I think it was on Inauguration Day, January 20th, 2017. I found myself with a lot of other all women business school classmates of mine, and we decided, or sort of kind of made a pact that we would do something about it. And from that event, Leadership Now was born. We are kind of our leader, our co-founder is a classmate of mine. She was in the State Department for 5 years under Secretary Clinton and Secretary Kerry. And so she really has been able to kind of help navigate this space and be able to kind of help us define our strategy in terms of how we look at things. And what we do as business leaders is we use our networks, we use our investment to invest in candidates, to invest in organizations that are doing the work that we feel kind of moves us forward as a democracy. So Anne was kind enough to share your definition of racism, which I think is really spot on. So the use of institutional power to deny or grant people or groups of people rights, respect, representation, and resources based on their skin color. I had really a question for the group. I think one of the things that is kind of intriguing is when as an individual, when did you first become aware of racism and become aware of when someone is, maybe they're treated differently because of their race or because of their color of their skin. So Anne or Blythe, do you mind putting that poll up? Great. So it seems like over about 60%. Oh, I think I have to share results. 60% of you have said in elementary school. I think that is quite young and quite observant. I think for me, it really was in middle school. I was sharing with the senior class that I spent my elementary school, middle school years in Mexico. I think the sort of caste system in Mexico is pretty prevalent. And I think coming to the US, there's this sort of idea that the US is a melting pot and that our system is, kind of racially blind or equal for everyone. And I think as you've probably seen, as I've seen, and as we've dug into the sort of systematic racism that exists, that's not true. And so there's a lot of work to be done. So, sorry, I keep on moving ahead. Okay, so America's founding principles of liberty and justice really have always been compromised, right? Because when our Constitution was created, the reality is that Black Americans were enslaved at that time. So it really wasn't liberty and justice for all. And even today, 150 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, that legacy really still persists in our society, our culture, and our government. And really our democratic institutions are complicit in furthering racial injustice. And we really can't have a true democracy until we acknowledge it and address that fact. I think I have to move, yeah, there, that is helpful. Sorry. Okay, so in 2020, we were confronted with really grievous racial disparities. I think everyone is aware of the criminal justice disparities that we encountered with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor's murder at the hands of our police officers. There's economic disparities. Unemployment rate left a lot of Black and people of color behind, and health disparities. So these injustices are really the latest in a long string of indicators of racial inequality. So if we look at our criminal justice system, if you start to really look at the data, it really jumps out at you at how much inequality there is, right? So Black Americans make up 13% of the total US population, but account for 25% of fatalities from police shootings. The average sentence for Black American is 19% higher than for a white American convicted of the same crime. And then there's economic disparities. So unemployment rate for Black Americans is almost 17% compared to 14% for white Americans. And 73% of Black Americans do not have the funds to cover expenses in an emergency, compared to only 40% of white counterparts. And if you look at the health disparities, Black Americans are 2 times more likely to be uninsured than white Americans. And if you look at the history of our healthcare system in the US that was really created after World War II, there was, Europe became kind of a socialized healthcare system. In US, we didn't do that. And part of that was because the hospitals didn't want to become desegregated. So they wanted to keep that segregation. And what ended up happening was that we ended up tying health insurance to employment, which a lot of Black Americans at the time were farmers, self-employed, so they didn't get health insurance, or were part-time migrant workers. And so these are some of the examples of how institutional decisions really create a disparity in outcomes for individuals of color. So countless initiatives have been launched to address a lot of these issues, but they haven't really had much lasting effect, right? So we've all seen awareness campaigns, safety net programs, anti-bias training, but despite these initiatives, really racial injustices persist. So police shootings aren't prosecuted. Over a 5-year period, less than 1% of police shootings were prosecuted. And we saw before that there are more shootings and fatalities among Black Americans and people of color. So if we look at the race wealth gap, that has actually increased over the last 30, 40 years. So if you look at this chart, the gray line is white Americans, blue is Hispanic, yellow is Black. And you can see, despite an awareness around some of these issues, that white Americans have benefited from increases in GDP and economic growth, while people of color have remained stagnant over this period. If you look at healthcare again, infant mortality is 130% higher for Black Americans, and life expectancy is 3%, 3 years longer. And so why have we not made any more progress? And it's because that the racism that drives these outcomes is not in just individuals. It's not made up of a few bad apples. It's really institutional. And these institutions that we've talked about, law enforcement system, the economic system, our healthcare systems, are created and shaped by our democracy. And our democracy is broken. So here's what happens. What we do at Leadership Now is we look at like 4 leading indicators of democracy scorecard. And I'll show you the democracy scorecard for California later. And we do this at the state level and at the national level. So we look at voting rights. We look at the electoral system. So how our system is made up and how people are counted, and that includes like the census, electoral college, and just the voting system. We look at campaign finance. So the funding that goes into electing candidates, and leaders and talent. So the overall pool of individuals that are going to become the leaders, the elected leaders that sort of shape and decide our laws. So voter ID laws, voter purges, and felony disenfranchisement disproportionately impact Black and Brown Americans. So if we look at each of those three areas, which are just three specific examples, I mean, there really is countless data to kind of back up these claims. But some states have made it more difficult to vote. And by some of the ways that they make it more difficult to vote is by requiring a government issued ID. You may not think that that's not hard to get a government issued ID. Everyone has a driver's license, but that's actually not true, right? So if you look at voting age citizens without a government issued ID, it's only 8% of white Americans, but it's 25% of Black Americans, 19% of Native Americans. So it's just another hurdle to put in front of voters that make it less likely that they will vote. Another example, actually, that's not on this slide, I actually had a call earlier today with Mark Elias, who's he's a lawyer that's presenting a voting rights case in front of the Supreme Court right now. And he was sharing that in Georgia, in the 2018 election, if you looked at polling places that had over 80% white voters, the average wait time at a polling location was 8 minutes. If you looked at polling locations where there was over 80% Black voters, the average wait time was 51 minutes. That's really a huge disparity in voting time. And what that does is that, a lot of people don't have 51 minutes to wait in their day. So that means they won't vote. And that means not only will they not vote in that election, it could also be that they don't vote in future elections because you're making it that much harder. Voter purges also happen. And this is the act of removing allegedly ineligible voters, but purges happened more likely in counties that have voters of color. And felony disenfranchisement. So this is an old sort of Jim Crow law, right? So after emancipation, there were a lot of laws that were put on the books that incarcerated a lot of people of color. And then they made it laws at the state level that people of color couldn't vote because they'd been in jail. So in some examples in Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, more than 1 in 5 Black Americans has lost their voting rights due to felony disenfranchisement. So that a lot of that is changing. I think you probably saw in Florida, the rules had changed for the 2020 election. And so, people are looking at that more closely. So if we look at electoral maps, the Electoral College and census, they underrepresent citizens of color and dilute their power. So I don't know if you guys know the term gerrymandering. It actually refers to an individual who actually was a Democrat, over 100 years ago, that first came up with the concept of, wait, if I start drawing the county maps, and the electoral maps differently within each state, I can decide the outcome of what those voters would do. So there's a term called cracking, which is splitting voters among disparate districts to dilute their vote. And then there's a term called packing, which is concentrating voters into a single district to limit the number of representatives that they can elect. So if you look at this slide, you can see a map of, this is North Carolina. And in 2010, when Democrats controlled the state legislature, they drew the maps. And you can see the blue is, Democrat controlled counties, and red are Republican controlled counties. And then after the 2010 election, Republicans controlled the state legislature. They redid the maps, and now the sort of election is flipped. And there was widespread gerrymandering. So redrawing of maps after the 2012 really elections. And that really, what that does is that makes it so that the politicians are deciding who gets elected as opposed to the people deciding who gets elected. And there's, I was sharing with Anne earlier that there is a really good documentary called Slay the Dragon that really does a really nice job of kind of explaining what redistricting is and why it's so egregious and anti-democratic. There are other areas that I won't go into a lot of depth in, but if you looked at the Electoral College, there's also underrepresentation of people of color and also in the census as well. Now, if we look at campaign finance, campaigns are primarily funded by white Americans, giving them undue influence over elected officials. So campaign donations are highly concentrated. So white people make up 60% of the US population, but account for 90% of the top 1% of wealth, the donor class. So you can see from the data here what the makeup of the US population is. On the left side, and but then you can see the top 1%, which is the donor class, how that's predominantly white. And what that results in is that Black and brown candidates don't receive less donations and therefore get elected less frequently. So if we look at representation, white Americans are overrepresented in elected office, giving their voice and policy priorities undue power. So if you look at the US population again, breakdown by race, and then compare that to political candidates, you can see that white candidates are overrepresented. And then if you look at the policy differences based on race and ethnicity, you can see that there's a disproportionate look at the issues that candidates focus on, and therefore it defines our policy and what becomes important. Some of the other examples of racism in our system is like there's small things that you can do, right? There's studies done that say the first candidate on the ballot is more likely to get elected versus, others that are farther down. And so that is an individual making that decision, right? In terms of which candidates get put at the top. And it's historically less likely to be a candidate of color. So so that's sort of looking at the big picture and looking historically. I wanted to also just share what's going on today. So since the inauguration and since the 2020 elections, there has been a widespread effort at state legislatures to introduce more voting restrictions. So there are over 300 bills across 46 states that have been introduced just in the last 6 weeks. And I don't know if most people don't know that state legislatures are only in session for the first half of the year. So the decisions that get made really in the next few weeks are going to decide the 2022 and the 2024 elections, right? How we treat those. And the big lie that there was fraud in the 2020 election is spurring this kind of widespread effort to introduce bills that are going to restrict voting, and it's disproportionately going to restrict people of color. So if we take Georgia as an example, there are 2 bills that are in front of the state legislature, and they really focus on absentee voting and reducing polling hours. So, a lot of predominantly Black voters in Georgia vote after church on Sunday. And so one of the provisions in this bill is to not have polling places, early voting and polling places open on Sunday and that's specific, that's like absolutely directed at Black voters. So this is a hot topic right now. you know, I don't know if you guys have seen a lot of the, you know, in the news, the, you know, I saw a picture earlier when Anne, or I think Blythe was doing the presentation, and it looks like you guys met John Lewis. There is HR 4, which is the Voting Advancement Act, that is also known as John Lewis Act, that is, you know, been introduced in the House, and you know, hopefully we'll make it to the Senate, make it into law. But I think what we need here is we need federal laws to really make it harder for individual states to restrict voting. And so part of what we do at Leadership Now is to, you know, gather business voices, business leaders, to make it clear that, one, we won't support candidates that don't support democracy, and you know, just make sure that we're protecting our workers, our community, and our democracy. So I talked earlier about California. I think I'm going over time, so I won't dive into this, but actually we have a whole deck on California that I'm happy to share with you guys. But you might think California is a liberal state, we do pretty well. And actually, as we looked at the data, we gave California a score of a C. And it's looking at these categories of voting, electoral systems, campaign finance, and talent representation. So, you know, there is work to be done, not just at the national level, not just in southern states or Republican states, but really locally as well. And, you know, talking about John Lewis, you know, I love this quote, and I think it is part of what has kind of motivated me to look into this work, right? If you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to do something about it. I personally don't have a background in any of this research. I come at this as a concerned citizen, as I said before, and using my, you know, project management skills, my negotiation skills from business school, my engineering skills, trying to look at the data and think critically about issues, being able to kind of lend my voice to, you know, ensuring that our democracy is sound. And they, you know, just want to end on, there are concrete actions that really can break this cycle. And, you know, just thinking about things that you can do as well. So I know a lot of the seniors here aren't old enough to vote yet, but you will be soon. So, you know, part of our actions is to vote. And particularly in local elections. There is a professor at Tufts, Eitan Hirsch. He talks about political hobbyism and really how these days people view politics as kind of like a sport, right? And it's really at the national level. And, you know, and so most people vote during national elections, but really where the laws get made and where the real work is done is at the local level. And those happen more frequently, and there's a lot less fanfare about it, and there's a lot less voter turnout. So if you do turn out, you can have much more of an impact. And if you can gather your community around it, you can have an even bigger impact. Leadership Now also has a Business for Racial Equity pledge that we've gotten over, I think, 1,300 signatures from prominent business leaders, but also, you know, from concerned citizens. I would welcome sharing that around the Mount Madonna community. And then a lot of what we do is support organizations that are defending and amplifying the Black and Brown vote. And, you know, fighting for democracy reform. I have a slide that lists some of the organizations that we support. And then we also look at supporting candidates of color who are advancing racial justice and democracy reform. So I'll end just on some of the organizations that we support nationally and are starting to look at more local organizations as well. So I think I'm a little bit over time, but I will end with that.
Thank you, Lakshmi. For the next section tonight, we're going to turn it over to our seniors, and I'm going to let Octavio introduce us.
Hi, Octavio.
Hi. Okay, thank you again for taking the time to speak with us tonight. We are the senior class of Mount Madonna School, and as a part of our values in World Thought class, we have prepared some questions for you. Thanks again for speaking with us about all these important issues. We are honored to have this opportunity.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm the first question up on the list. You listed voting, particularly in local elections, as something we can do to prevent injustice within our democracy. So how can we make voting in local elections more accessible to new and young voters with no experience in politics?
So I think that there should be more awareness campaigns, right? And I think that that's something that young people can really help with. I think disproportionately young people are really focused on more of the national elections. And, you know, I think I certainly was when I was younger. And there are, I mean, are you aware of any awareness campaigns that really encourage voters to vote in local elections? And I'm not just talking about the midterms, right? You know, in the off years, every 2 years outside of, you know, for like senators and congressmen. I'm really talking about like councilmen and, you know, in some localities, right, like judges and sheriffs, really at the local level. And I think there would be an opportunity for kind of a grassroots movement of young people. And one of the groups that we work with is Students Vote, Students Learn. And part of what they're doing is to build that. So I hope, Sarah, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I just was really, I think it's an important thing that we tell other people and other young people to vote, because it wasn't until about this year and maybe part of last year that the importance of local elections was really like impressed on me. And I know that's because like Mount Madonna has a very rich curriculum, and like I can imagine people who don't maybe aren't as into politics or government just not knowing that, and it kind of seeming a little bit overwhelming and not as popular as the like national elections, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there are different ways that you can build awareness, right? So, you know, we do like, we have like a LinkedIn and Twitter, you know, kind of communications plan to build awareness about some of the causes that we care about, you know, obviously for a younger generation, there are other social media tools that you might want to use other than those. But we write also op-eds, right, to put influential pieces in newspapers and journals that kind of other business leaders and like-minded people will read and become aware of, and think about what, you know, the media that you consume and how you could put your voice out there in the same way, right? So that other people like you that might not be aware of the importance of local elections, how are they going to hear about that? And I bet that they'd rather hear it from you than someone like me, right? They'd rather hear it from a peer than someone like me. So just, you know, if you can figure out a plan to get in front of your peers, I think that would be really worthwhile. Thank you for your question.
Oliver, I think you're up next.
Yep. Currently, I, like a couple other people in my class, are too young to vote. Do you have any suggestions for people that cannot vote but still want to make an impact?
So I think not being eligible to vote just yet doesn't preclude you from the same answer I had for Sarah, right, around building awareness. And I do know that we had a campaign and we worked with Students Learn, Students Vote to recruit poll workers, because you can actually be, I think in a lot of states, including California, you can be like a student 16, 17 and still become a poll worker, which is really highly needed, especially during COVID. There was a huge gap there. Also, I actually think it's really important that that the makeup of the community, the poll workers reflect that, right? So I know my polling station, and I think most of the places I voted, it's always a much older individual. It's predominantly white individuals. If we could change that makeup so that people see themselves reflected in the officials that are taking their vote, I think that that would be a huge contribution. So that's one way, but I think building awareness, education, that you don't have to be old enough to vote to really have an impact there.
Thank you.
I think I'm next. Laxmi, I know you talked about states imposing more discriminatory and restrictive voting laws. And I know we're currently dealing with a Supreme Court case involving Arizona. So I'm wondering if the Supreme Court rules in favor of upholding Arizona's current restrictive voting laws, what can we do to mitigate the results and prevent sort of a ripple effect?
Well, that's a great question. So Leadership Now led an amicus brief, which is a letter to the Supreme Court signed by about 300 business leaders, kind of laying out our thought process with academic research on, why they should not really, it's Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act that is really under attack in Breckner versus the DNC. Regardless of what happens in that case, if we can pass new voting laws, right, which is HR 4, then that would supersede the previous Voting Rights Act. There will likely be court battles after that, but I would say the best thing we can do, right, like we can play defense on all of these restrictive voting bills that are coming into state legislatures or being fought in court, but then we also have to play offense, right, and introduce good bills. And I would say that is really the solution, regardless of what happens in Breckner versus DNC, that we need to pass good voting laws that really protect people, make it easier to vote, and make sure that there's access, but it's still a safe process, right? And I think that's what's tricky with some of the bills. If we look at Georgia as an example, is there are actually some good things in some of these bills, right? That makes it more efficient, cut costs, from the system. And yet there's also some, there's a lot of restrictions. And so being able to kind of analyze that and decide what, like really fight the egregious laws is kind of where we're at right now. But to answer your overall question, I think we need to introduce some good bills to really protect voting for everyone. Who's next? Is that Savannah? I can't hear you.
No.
We can't hear you, Sav.
We can barely hear you. Maybe get closer to your speaker.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me know if you can't hear me. My mic is kind of iffy sometimes. In doing my research, I noticed that you've done a lot throughout your life. Have you discovered parallels between aspects of your life that were unexpected, which help you prepare or succeed in other parts of your life?
Oh, that's a question I was not expecting. I don't know. I'm not sure I've really planned my life, right? So I started out as an engineer. There were aspects of that I liked. I went to business school. My career has, I've started working at large companies, and as I've gone, as I've kind of progressed, I've ended up at smaller and smaller companies. And I think I have just sort of followed my passion and followed the opportunities that have been presented to me, and really, the kind of work that I enjoy. I think I actually realized that I like working, I like bringing structure to a lot of chaos. And the startup space, the democracy reform space, there's a lot of chaos. And so having the education and the kind of practice that I've had as an engineer and as a business person is trying to put some structure around a lot of the chaos that I see. And personally, I never sort of thought that I really don't like politics, to be honest, right? I mean, I think there's something, I find it messy. I find, I find a lot of hypocrisy in politics. And so I never thought that I'd end up in this space. And yet I felt compelled to do it as a reaction to something I felt was like really unjust in our system. And I had friends and colleagues that felt the same way. And so kind of coming together and creating something like this has been really rewarding and, just an opportunity that I kind of pursued. Next, is there another question?
Yes, that would be me.
Hi, sir.
Hi. As you pointed out in your slideshow, 2020 has highlighted the many different types of inequalities in our country, and as such, racial justice movements have gained attention. How can we maintain this forward momentum as the year progresses?
That's an excellent question. I think we have an opportunity with an administration that cares deeply about a lot of these issues. We have a short period of time, right, where the Democrats control the House, they control the Senate, and we have to decide what laws we want to pass, and to make sure that the institution gets progresses, and that there are laws that kind of can be sustainable. So yeah, I think we have a short period of time, and that's why, it's funny, as I thought about the election and I thought, kind of came down to the election, then there was a runoff in Georgia, and it was like, okay, our work here is done. And actually, we look forward, our work is not done. We're at a really critical time, right? And I think we have to decide, do we compromise? What do we really care about? What are our priorities? And I also think that we need to think more locally as well. There's some really great solutions to some of the issues that I point out in the presentation. So for example, I think our primary system is broken, and I think it encourages extremist candidates. So there's a system called ranked choice voting. I don't know if you guys have heard of the term ranked choice voting, but it's a new way to elect officials. So you're not just electing an individual in a primary, you're ranking all of the candidates so that you can you can sort of then add up the aggregate, and you end up with potentially a more moderate voice, right? So New York City just passed ranked choice voting. So we're about to have our first mayoral election with that system. It passed in Alaska. So we'll see some change there. It didn't pass in Massachusetts, but I think it will be on the ballot next. So there's a real big movement there. So I think that there's some real opportunity for change down the horizon. It's just what do we prioritize? And I think we have this short window right now to make some big lasting impact.
Corey has the last question from us.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I've been at Mount Madonna for over half my life, and I know it's going to play a large role in how I move forward in the world. and I'm curious about the impact MMS has left on you and your life.
That's an excellent question. So I came to Mount Madonna in 10th grade, and I was there for 3 years. I think Mount Madonna has had a lasting effect on how I view the world, the contributions that I make in my community and beyond, and the role I play as an individual. I know that you guys aren't able to take some of the trips that we usually take as seniors, but I remember, I think it was my junior year, we went to DC. And had amazing interviews and conversations with leaders that were doing good work. I think my senior year we went to Mexico City and did the same. I think my stepfather, who's here, helped organize that trip. And so being able to contribute to your community, but then being able to see really what's going on in the rest of the world and being able to have an impact, I definitely think it shaped me. And it's probably one of the reasons it's sort of the path led me to leadership now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lakshmi. I think now, Anna, returning it over to the audience for questions.
We're going to turn it over to the audience. So you can put questions in the chat box, or you can raise your virtual hand using the reaction button at the bottom of your screen. And so while we're waiting for questions to come in, I want to read some of the comments that have already come in. Prabha Pacey said, such rich information. Thank you for the incredible synthesis of the historical impact of what is happening today. And lots of people are supporting the idea of I love ranked choice. Yes, please. Ranked choice makes so much sense. Me too. So there's lots of support for that idea.
Yes, it makes complete sense. Yeah. And we work with, we actually have a lot of academic advisors. So Catherine Gale, Michael Porter are two of our advisors out of Harvard Business School. And they've done a lot of academic research on ranked choice voting. And it could solve a lot of our partisanship, I think.
Sarah Vince has a question. Sarah, if you unmute yourself, you can ask your question, please.
You mentioned on slide 17 of your slideshow, you talked about restricted voting, and you mentioned a case about restricting voting polls on Sundays. And I was just a bit curious if that's a conflict of church and state, because would not working Sunday be considered like a religious?
So are you saying not allowing people to vote on Sunday would be restrictive, or allowing them to vote on Sunday would be restrictive?
Not allowing them to.
Yeah, I don't know if that is the argument that's made legally. I don't think there's a religious aspect to that. A lot of states will allow what they call like early voting. It varies by state, but like New York, I know is I believe up to 3 weeks before voting, before election day. And it's mostly on weekends, not necessarily because of the religious aspect, but just because of, people that work and allowing more flexibility to be able to take time off of, that not having to take time off of work to be able to vote. And so that's the logic. I think in my comments, I had said about the church, because there has been a grassroots movement specifically in Georgia to encourage, at the churches, to encourage voters to vote after the church service. So that's been a part of like a lot of the grassroots movement to encourage specifically Black voters to vote. So I don't think it was necessarily tied to the church. It's just that you know, as you look at where do people congregate, where they're getting their advice, where do they see the leaders in their community, in a lot of those communities in Georgia, it's around their church. So it's not really a church and state issue necessarily. It's just about like, where do people congregate and how do you make it flexible, and really it's that ease of voting.
We also have a question in the chat. It says, what about the Electoral College and filibuster? ... Thoughts?
Yeah, so I, again, will state that I'm not a policy expert or a lawyer. Leadership Now, we've discussed Electoral College. We decided not to take a position on the Electoral College. I think that you know, is probably something that will be tackled down the line. I think it's not really a priority right now, but certainly, you know, there are all sorts of issues with Electoral College, and you could have a whole presentation on like the history of the Electoral College, why it was put in place the way it was, and why it doesn't work for our democracy right now. The filibuster, I think, you know, I think Biden has just come out and he said that he's in favor of a talking filibuster. I think the filibuster is not democratic. I think it is anti-democratic. So I think Leadership Now will soon take a position against the filibuster.
Very interesting. I want to honor everyone's time, especially Laxmi. She's calling from the East Coast. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. I would really like to thank you for an inspiring evening and sharing your wisdom and insight about ways to safeguard our democracy and how we can continue to work to build a more just and equitable society. I really am inspired, even more so because this isn't your primary occupation. This is something that was driven really from a grassroots interest. And so you took all of your skill sets that you've developed over the years, and I find that fascinating. So thank you so much. It's really been an honor.
Yeah, thank you so much for reaching out, for allowing me to speak to the seniors and to the community. I have a fondness for Mount Madonna, and I've been away for too long. So this has been a really great opportunity for me to get to see the community again. Thank you.
Well, we're certainly glad you're back, and we hope to stay in touch. And I would also like to acknowledge our seniors and Shannon once again. So thank you for facilitating this meaningful conversation. And if this evening inspired you to learn more, I encourage you to attend our next seminar, which is on April 15th. It's by Dr. Noah Diffenbaugh, who is going to speak about sustainable development, the climate energy equity nexus. So I encourage you all to attend that. Before we leave, Carson Kelly is going to get on, and he's going to also give you another opportunity to continue working with us so that you too can also get inspired and join another opportunity to learn. Carson.
Indeed. Thanks, Anne. So go ahead, and we're going to talk just very briefly about a book group that we're starting called, it's based on this book, Cast. I think there's probably a number of people that have already, maybe read the book. I haven't yet, but I've just heard tremendous things about it. So if you're interested and have heard about the book and would like to participate in a book club, would love to have you. There's information there will be a sign up in addition to this email that's on the screen. There will be a sign up in the survey that attendees will be receiving after this event. So yeah, come join us. I think it'll be a fascinating conversation.
Thank you so much. And once again, thank you, Laxmi. And I hope everybody has a wonderful evening. And please do join us for our later seminar series. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laxmi.
Thanks, everybody.